So here we go. Continuing with Richard Rohr's book, The Wisdom Pattern. And I am just amazed at how timely both his daily meditations and the reading of this book are in terms of scratching my itches. And so let's go to the next slide, please. And I want to tonight set as one of the contexts the fact that I am wanting everybody to vote. I want us to all work very, very hard to combat voter suppression and voter discouragement and out just horrible stuff against voting. It matters, and I want everybody to vote, and I care more about your voting than I care about who you vote for. And I want us to be thinking about rebuilding society on the other side of this presidential election. Because it seems to me that no matter who wins, we have so much healing that must be done of democracy and of the divisiveness in the divided states of America. And I just want to invoke some context and content from last time about Cynthia Bourgeault saying we need to go ahead and be living the laws of the next world. So many people are writing, and most recently I read my friend Marianne Williamson about it, how clear it is that life is, let me tell Horace that I'm on the Zoom right now, that we simply are seeing the death of an old world and the birth of a new one. And that is what's going on. And I want us to live in that sense of the other side of the presidential election and do a both and. Do all the stuff we need to do to protect the vote and to pray like hell for this presidential election, and to be living on the other side with the laws of the next world. So it's in dedication to that desire and prayer that we go on to the next slide. So this is a slide simply restating the thesis and argument of Brother Rohr. He would subscribe to there being a pre-modern civilization, certainly a modern civilization and a postmodern civilization. And he's saying that the rules of all of those things just won't work. Neither the myth of the uninterrupted progress, which is the modern thing, or postmodern nihilism will not do. And so I have the slide of the arrow going up to symbolize modernism, and then the nihilistic kind of despair. And I just wanted to remind us that this is the context, and he is in the midst of that saying, we really need to claim healthy Christian Paschal mystery. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Next slide. So I'm going to pause here for a while because Rohr is saying that another pattern is the wisdom pattern. And you can call it the Paschal mystery pattern. You can call it the transformation of woundedness pattern. All sorts of things. But I'm putting at the top right-hand corner of this slide an illustration of a game that transactional analysis says people can fall into. And it's called the drama game. And I just ask you to think about some people who might feed on drama. And in this game, there are three roles: the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. And the pernicious part of this game, according to this theory, is if you go into the victim role or the rescuer role or the persecutor role, within a nanosecond, you can flip into one of the others just to keep the drama going. So if you have messianic complexes like and neuroses, like I and all priests and all helping professional people do, to always come to the rescue, you can very easily go into the victim role or the persecutor role. There is a very different way to live in the world, and that is, in the language of transactional analysis, problem solver. You can be a community-oriented problem solver. Or what we're going to be talking about tonight, you can be a change agent. And Richard Rohr is saying you cannot be a change agent without being a wounded healer, without being in touch with your wounds, like we were trying to do in the Morning into Unity, being available to your sadness, and in your contemplative prayer life, to ask for those wounds to be transformed, which is what we heard last week, Richard Rohr saying is the sacred wound. When you have a wound that has been transformed, that's a sacred wound. So let's just kind of go through this text here. The classic pattern of transformation into who we are in God is called the Paschal Mystery. Now, just go back before we leave that one sentence. The issue is who we are in God. And that is a wonderful thing. Wounds and resurrection and all. And Rohr says that is the only theme of each and every Eucharist, because it is so necessary to believe. And Van Hall and I talk a lot about what the word belief means. I always argue that it means entrusting my life to, not a bunch of dogma or doctrine to which I assent. No, it's the things that I entrust my life. And because we will do anything to avoid this Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, or the wounded healer, or the transformation of our wounds, because Jesus presents this gift of God in the image of a resented banquet in Luke. Rohr says that the banquet, and this doesn't have to be a Christian only thing, but becoming a walking banquet as opposed to a walking courtroom, and you invite everybody into the banquet of life, no matter who it is that you've engaged that day. And in order to do that, there's a call for inclusiveness and forgiveness and transformation of our wounds. So when the wound happens in a secular society like ours, we usually look for an immediate way to resolve it, like playing the victim, back up to the victim, persecutor, rescuer drama game, mobilizing for vengeance, while sometimes calling it justice. We get so confused about what justice is. We're going to bring this person to justice. Well, justice is a much deeper concept than that, but we can get into that some other time. Or looking for someone to blame or sue. That's why I spent some time in that sermon Sunday saying that we have to have an attack-free zone in all of our lives. A sacred culture would never bother with such charades and missed opportunities, because every time I get annoyed, every time I get wounded, every time my schedule doesn't get filled, if I could please just pause, and have the contemplative mind enough to ask, what is this an opportunity for? What am I to learn here? Instead of jumping to blaming and shaming and attacking and suing, and those kinds of things. And the theme, he says, is constant in poetry, literature, and drama. These are words from last week, you'll remember. that the wounded one is always the one with the gift, and the comfortable one knows nothing. And Brian Stevenson, you'll remember from Just Mercy, says that he finally figured out why he was in the business he's in, because all these people were broken, and he was resonating himself in his own brokenness with their brokenness. So let's go to the next slide and let me check and see what has happened in the chat room. Yeah, Annabeth Valance is saying it feels like a lot of the story of the caterpillar becoming a butterfly. We're going to see some of that tonight. And Allison, I think that's beautiful as well. So a reminder, the deepest question is, who am I in God? So the crux of the matter with Jesus and Paul is the call to dying to the small self, which is the false self. That's the crux of the matter. Can I die to my small self so that I can have the capacity to be the instrument of my true self and of God's true self? If you don't learn how to die early, you spend the rest of your life avoiding failure. And when you can free your true self by dying to your small self, the whole spiritual life opens up. And my testimony, everybody, is that you can't do this without community. You can't die to your small self and open up to your true self alone. We are put into the communion of saints, which is a prelude to my sermon Sunday after next, when we celebrate All Saints Sunday. It's also a contemplative gift to pause enough to let grace come in and let you access grace, all of us. So the third sentence, the point of contemplative prayer, is letting go of your false self's plans and anxieties until you're empty of your small self and aware of the presence of the light, guidance, and cheer. Because that's what the light, I'm talking about the inner divine genius. I'm talking about the Christ within. I'm talking about the inner word, the logos. It always brings the presence of the divine. It always brings guidance, which is, for me, always surprising and a little confounding. And also some cheer. I always come out of my prayer time with great joy. Yes, hurrah for the communion of saints, for all the saints who from their labors rest. So Neil is asking, how does one do? So that's why I made those 6 YouTube prayer videos. And if you all have not watched those, I would really appreciate your watching it, both because I'm trying to convey something that's so very important to me, and I would love your critique. And so all you have to do is go to YouTube or our website, and you can find all 6, and they're from 7 to 10 minutes long. So St. Paul, we're still looking at the crux of the matter with Jesus and Paul. And Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ, which is the small and false self dying. The I, that is what the I, pronoun I, the antecedent of it is. And I live now not with my own life, but with the Christ who lives in me. That my own small self life feels utterly inadequate and now unnecessary. Those are Rohr's words on page, I've forgotten what page. And the life of Christ who lives in me is the realization of an indwelling, gratuitous lover. And let me just pause and tell you again, those of you who have heard this, and for those of you who haven't, you know, I was in psychotherapy with a psychiatrist for 8 years. And at the end, his name was Tom Malone, and they're in Atlanta. And he said, I think these 8 years have been about your discovering your inner divine genius. And that's the light that is within. And that we can access anytime we pause. Okay, next slide. That one took a long time. So, Annabeth, here's the chrysalis, the caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the butterfly. And it is simply an example, and I won't stay on this slide because it was in great part last week. I just added something to it, though, just to reinforce that the wisdom pattern that Rohr's book is all about is actually a universal truth. It shows up in all global religions. And it's God's universal pattern of trust and transformation. And I'm going to skip over the first bullet point right now and just quickly read through. In Eastern religions, all of this is called yin and yang. In nature religions, it's called darkness and light. In Jewish persons, it's called slavery and deliverance. Christians call it death and resurrection. Buddhism says there's suffering in all things. Sufis, the mystical Muslim religion, there's ecstasy in all things. Jesus' temptation story, there are wild beasts and angels in the wilderness of human life. And then all the seers, mystics, and prophets and great souls see the better angels of our nature without avoiding the tragic nature of human existence. Now, go back to the first bullet point. That's what I enlarged for tonight. And it has to do with the fact that dying is part of the mystery. We simply don't understand life until we understand death and life. Yet both sides of the mystery must be experienced and trusted. And Rohr, this is Rohr's language. God is dying in all things, and God is rising in all things. And both are going on at the same time. That's the yin and the yang. That's the mandala of life. That in every moment, something old and too small is dying. And something true and light-bringing is rising. It's the phoenix principle of the phoenix rising from the ashes, which of course is Atlanta, Georgia's symbol and the Diocese of Atlanta's symbol. So let's go to the next slide. So I think it's really important to understand that to live is to be wounded. The issue is what we do with the wounds. And that makes all the difference. I love Rohr's language on 91. Jesus was not about creating a new tribe of saved and superior people. Now, y'all, that's what I was taught as a kid, that the whole business of Christianity was to create a new tribe of saved and superior people. And God Almighty, did I get that superiority complex all the time. And unfortunately, when you pair that with slaveholder Christianity, the superiority stuff, distortion, is about a hierarchy of worth in the human family. It's what James Baldwin calls the lie. But what Rohr says that Jesus was about creating was not this new tribe of saved and superior people, but a remnant of people who were usable by God for all people. And the way it works is that the usability in us is the part of us that's familiar with dying to our small self, our egoic self, our false self, so that we can be instruments of peace. Everything that St. Francis puts into his prayer is a reversal that is needed for the new world of redemption to be created for all people. So our job is to let God use us as instruments for universal salvation, for universal grace, for universal forgiveness, for indeed big love. and still with Roar's language, back to him, to keep the whole world from its violent path toward destruction. Now, our friend Charles Eisenstein says that this new story of interbeing that is replacing the old story of the myth of the separate self. He also sometimes calls it a more beautiful world is possible, or the lengthier phrase is a more beautiful world that our heart knows is possible. What my friend Marianne Williamson was talking about, the old world falling apart, and so many people trying to hold on to something that really was not ever real and can't be created. This more beautiful world is universal. It applies to everybody being loved and valued equally. So we are called, all of us on this screen tonight, are called to be people committed to this apart from our ego satisfaction. In the end, it doesn't matter whether our ego gets satisfied. What matters is that we are usable by God. So I love this yin yang that I found there. Judith says, saved and superior separates us from the freedom of weekly confession and forgiveness. Oh my God, I've got a story on that, but I'm getting too long-winded here. But I love that bottom yin yang of the wounded healer becomes the change agent. And that's why I'm so glad we talked about Ida B. Wells, because if Wesley, the genius, was able to put her face in, we'll see her in a minute. So Wesley, let's go to the next slide. So this is, we won't stay long. This is a slide from last week because I love the way Rohr redefines old churchy terms. He redefines salvation. He redefines being born again. And being born again, he says, is having your life realigned because you've come through suffering alive and more whole. Doesn't mean you're going to stop being wounded, because that's going to happen. That's a promise. I added the word unseducible in the second line. We don't have time for all of that story, but it's a story I made up. I'll just tell the story some other time. But let me just say that those who trust that God is in the suffering are, what Rohr says, are literally indestructible. I think it's important to say that they are unseducible. There's so many people who come at you trying to seduce you into buying something or doing what they want you to do or to use your body or. And this process of the wounded healer or the sacred wound or the wound transformed, all of those things are synonymous in Rohr's thinking, have their life realigned. And they are loving, but you just can't seduce them because they don't have any ego anymore, or they are destroying their ego every day in contemplation. They're unflatterable. Now, of course, none of us ever gets to that point. Please, please, please. I'm flatterable as hell. And I'm working on it so that a greater value than my ego satisfaction is going on. Okay, next slide. So this is obviously from last week also, but I just wanted to remind us that Rohr thinks that the revelation of the Judeo-Christian scriptures is that God is the one who turns death into life, that God is always in the suffering, not causing the suffering, but in it. Okay, next slide. And this is from last week too, but I just really wanted it to be in this deck for the purpose of distinguishing between two different minds in Rohr's thinking. You have your calculating mind and the contemplative mind. And in contemplation, you literally go through a process of letting go of the calculating mind. And you come to the mind of Christ, which I added to the slide. It's the fifth line from the bottom, where St. Paul tells us that we literally have the mind of Christ inside of us. The issue is to get access to it. And we get access to it by letting go in that contemplative journey that I talk about in those prayer videos, so that for a moment, the calculating mind can evaporate. Now, the calculating mind is always available, ready to come back in. All of us, none of us is never, ever, ever totally free of the calculating mind. And we can be free of the calculating mind. Next slide. Thank you. You did get Ida B. Wells in there. Oh, Wesley, you're a genius. So this is a brand new slide, and I want to spend some time with it. Yay, Ida B. Wells. Richard Rohr talks about how they have this saying in their community in Albuquerque, the Center for Action and Contemplation, that the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. And Richard Rohr says that that's the distinguishing characteristic of people who out of their lives live a social and political reform. Now, let me unpack that. We're talking about everyday people. Now, I know that I've got some non-everyday people here, but I know three of them. I count them as friends. I know them personally. And when you get to know them, they really are regular, broken people. So to quote Rohr, the spiritual longings of ordinary people is the basis for most social and political reforms. And that comes from the spirit of constructive postmodernism. Remember, he's been a critic so far in this book of postmodernism. But he says you can get to a place where you can be a constructive postmodernist, which means that it's Robert Inchausti's phrase. He's a wonderful scholar and has done a wonderful book on Merton. And postmodernism is what comes after the modern civilization. And Rohr's critique of it is it's too much given to reductionism and nihilism. But you can use a constructive aspect of it because it's got a bunch of skepticism in it. Postmodernism is skeptical, and what it needs to work on is whether or not it's going to be despairing. But here's an important sentence. People who know the challenges of life, but they build anyway. I think you've heard me say that one of the most important words in the whole Bible is the word nevertheless. When people have crushing experiences and they say, nevertheless, God is here and moving me forward. And it's not naive denial. It's not Pollyanna idealism. It's not utopianism. But it's what Rohr says is the true biblical hope that can only be received on the other side of suffering and failure. And these are those who have gone through the deconstructive stage and then gone on to the reconstructive gift of vision and hope. Somehow they have been rebuilt people who are rebuilt or realigned in a new form. Okay, so let's tell the stories really quickly of the three people here who I know. And Oprah Winfrey and I have worked together closely, and I count her as a friend. And most of her sufferings are very, very public about her being raped and abused by a family member, being somebody against whom racism has been practiced. And on the other side of that, I mean, she's a very prayerful. I can attest to the sincerity of her prayer life. She told me one night, Ed, my daily prayer is use me, a 2-word prayer. So we've already talked about Brian Stevenson, who's in the bottom right corner of someone who is in touch with his brokenness. And that's how he resonates with people with whom he works. And Gene Robinson, the first openly gay bishop of the Episcopal Church, really deep inner struggling person about his own sexual identity, his own orientation, sexual orientation, and just lived this faithful life. And finally, the people of that diocese asked him to be their bishop, and he's done a wonderful job. And in his retirement, he's doing a wonderful job. And when we scratch the story of Ida B. Wells, which you can do in Catherine Meeks's book, you find the same kind of person with struggle. The point is, you never can be a leader. And remember, that's what I'm talking about tonight. How are you and I going to lead individually and corporately on the other side of this election? You can't do that without getting in touch with your wound, understanding that it's a sacred wound, and it's taught you stuff. It has given you a diploma in life that you can use and create this new world that we all have to create on the other side of this election. Okay, next slide. So I decided that I needed to put a couple of slides in about Raphael Bostic. So Professor Bostic, Dr. Bostic, is the head of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. And I interviewed him today for this coming Sunday's forum, because he did the unprescribed and predicted thing this summer of, after meditating on the death of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others, and feeling the woundedness of all of that and the suffering of all that, he said, I've got to say what I know about racism not only being harmful to human bodies, but that it is actually harmful to the American economy. Here's somebody who taught economics at UCLA, or I'm sorry, USC. I've forgotten which one. Y'all don't please tell my California friends that I got this confused. Oh Lord, I've created the cardinal sin, committed a cardinal sin. Anyway, he taught, and then he came to Atlanta as the head of the Fed, the Federal Reserve. And he writes this essay this summer. And at the bottom of the slide, it says the name of the essay, A Moral and Economic Imperative to End Racism. Google it, it'll come up real fast. In which he says that because we have systemic racism, sometimes he talks about institutionalized racism, we are hurting America and we are hurting our economy. Therefore, we must end unjust and destructive practices. So he goes on to talk about the institutions hurt not only African Americans they've targeted, but the systemic racism they've codified also hurt and continue to hurt America and its economy. By limiting economic and educational opportunities for a large number of Americans, institutionalized racism constrains this country's economic potential. And we have a moral and an economic imperative to end these unjust and destructive practices. And today, in this amazing conversation he and I had, he kept going back and forth between the moral and the practical. He says, I want to appeal to people's morality. But my point in all the stuff that he'll unpack in this forum is to show the practical harm to everybody economically because of institutionalized racism. Okay, next paragraph. Next slide. So I don't know why my stuff was messed up here on this slide, but when you print it out, you'll be able to see. I was just interested that in the first part of his essay, he said it was important for us to get the story straight. And we've talked so much about getting the story straight. And I love it every time Lee gets so upset because she's having to relearn American history, because that's what all of us are having. He was a Trojan. Okay. Thank you very much, Rollin. I love you. USC. Ed, remember USC. Okay, back to this. So he names 6 things that we have had in American history: slavery, the federal law considering 3/5 compromise by the founding fathers, redlining, legal segregation, voter suppression, racial profiling in police, and we have got to have a different world. Well, I just happened to mention to him, I said, Raphael, I loved the fact, okay, Susan Walker is recommending Darktown, a historical fiction novel about the first African-American police officer. Wow, thanks. I said, Raphael, I was just struck by the fact that you were calling us to get the story straight. Let's tell the true truth. And then I just went on, to set up my other question. He said, no, I want to come back. I want to come back to the story about your point about narration. And so I talked to him about all of us are being involved in re-narration at St. Luke's, trying to deconstruct the old toxic narratives we've been getting and reconstructing a new, true, life-giving story. And he said that is so important. So I'm so eager for y'all to hear him just interrupt my question and say, no, Ed, I want to come back to this business about getting the story straight. And for those of you who've been kind of following along, remember we've had a time with Charles Eisenstein saying it's so important to know what your story is. And he's the one who talks about the story of separateness versus the story of interbeing. And he said, whatever story you have determines what policies you live by. And you're in charge of the story. It's that important. And that's the point that Raphael Bostic was making, that if you're going to have a story that says a certain percentage of people are more valuable and are worth more than others, that is going to cause policies that will harm those people you think are inferior. So the reason I wanted to illustrate this slide with Isabel Wilkerson's cast is it is one of the newest and most popular nonfiction books right now to set the American history straight. And we are going to have this as our Lenten study book with our wonderful friends at Ebenezer Baptist Church. So go ahead and get your copy, be reading it, and we'll set or listen to it, and we'll set the story straight, but also listen to how impassioned Raphael was. Okay, I got to wrap this up. Next slide. So this is where we end tonight. We got, I think, 2 more slides real quickly. But it sets us up for the 5th chapter in Rohr's book called The Cosmic Egg. And I just think it's very, very helpful. He said, if we're going to be rebuilders of society, and this is what tonight has been about, are we who are watching one another on this screen, are we going to be rebuilders of society? In order for you and me to be rebuilders of the society, we have to be rebuilt inside. Now, this is a classic Thomas Merton move. If you're going to be a reconciler out there of disparate parts of the culture, you've got to reconcile all those different disparate parts inside your own soul. And of course, Merton says the only way you can do that is have these new seeds of contemplation, have a contemplative life. Whatever that is, you listen to my first prayer video, and I do not say that my way of praying is the only way you pray. You have to find your own way, but I've got some guidelines. Second sentence, a healthy psyche lives within at least 3 containers of meaning. And so he invites you to imagine these 3 domes or levels of meaning. And the first is called my story. The second is our story. And the third is the story. What is? He says, this is what I call the cosmic egg. It is the unique and almost unconscious gift of all healthy religions. And much of the genius of the biblical revelation is that it honors and integrates all 3. So the person who is the saint / whole / healed person lives happily inside of all 3. And that's what we'll talk about next week, just as a teaser. Next slide. So I'm hearing Richard Rohr call us to be rebuilders of the world. And in order to be rebuilders of the world, we have to be rebuilt inside. And here's the wonderful quotation from Dr. King: I can change the world with my own 2 hands. Make it a better place with my own 2 hands. Make it a kinder place with my own 2 hands. I think we have the next slide is the last one. So I just want to swing back to the Morning into Unity project that we've participated in the last 2 Monday nights. I've had revelations every time we've done this. The first week was to give me the phrase, the practice of mourning. And the last one, in my small little circles of healing that we broke out into, after we introduced ourselves, we were to say, what are we mourning tonight? And it was so powerful. It was not maudlin. We didn't get stuck in it. It was so revealing and liberating. Next slide. So here is Rohr. Thank you so much, Wesley, for this. This is what Judy put in the chat box tonight. Here's some suggestions what we can learn from the pandemic. Humanity, you are all one. You're one beloved community. And he always does the both and move. And you are one global sickness. You're all contagious and always have been, unconsciously infecting and yet able to also bless one another. There are no higher and lower in this world. That's the lie that Jimmy Baldwin said is eating up American history. There's no smart or stupid, no totally right or totally wrong. The only meaningful division is between those who serve and those who allow themselves to be served. All the rest is temporary posturing. Many to whom you look for power and leadership have shown themselves to have empty hands, minds, and hearts. We are all bereft of all satisfying explanations, all ledgers of deserving and undeserving. No perfect answers or absolute heroes. We must all wear a mask to protect the other from me. Don't play the victim. Victimhood is always a waste of time. Do y'all remember the drama triangle that I had earlier? God's time and your time is a waste of time, just like anxiety is a waste of time. Instead, try to learn the important lessons. We are all in the same elementary school now. Remember Oprah Winfrey talking about how we are all in an evolutionary class. We're all in the same elementary school now. Here we must learn to stand in two different places and to change places often. The served must also be the servants, and the servants must also be the served. To stay in the eternal circle of the suffering and the servants. Christians call it the body of Christ. We are not the first or the last generation that gets to suffer and to serve on this earth. So I'm assuming that's the last slide, right, Leslie? Yeah. So we're going to go to our small groups. I hope that you all will stay. And I know a lot of people leave at this point, but it's worth being in these small groups. I'd love to invite you to start, if anybody has anything that they're mourning tonight, to simply say that. And that can be in terms of the mourning or the wound or the suffering. And then please respond to, how do you feel called to rebuild the society on the other side of the presidential election as a rebuilt person inside? To rebuild society, we must be rebuilt inside.